Right, good afternoon everyone. My name's Geoff Steward. I'm head of litigation at Stobbs and I really dislike lookalikes. And we're going to explore why over the next 2 hours. There's a couple of housekeeping things. Fire escapes up the top there. There are no drills planned, so if you hear them, or if you're here from Aldi and Lidl and want to escape, that's how you get out. We are videoing it. We're only going to video release clips of it, probably of the speakers, but we're having a Q&A session at the end. I'd like it to be Chatham House as much as we can, so if people want to speak freely and openly, we obviously won't be releasing any of that. So we've got a panel session at the end, so do feel free to speak openly at that. We are having 3 sessions, 3 speakers. I'll introduce them shortly. But then we're going to have a short break. We are in a cinema, so you will be getting ice cream at the break. And then we're going to have a Q&A panel session. It's a discussion session. We are encouraging as many of you to take part in that as possible. You've got a lot of experts here today if you have questions. If not, we could happily talk about it amongst ourselves for a good day or so, but we've got half an hour. So do please engage in the Q&A if you get the chance. A few thank yous. Firstly, most importantly to our speakers. We have got, hopefully, a number of you have seen the Psychology of Lookalikes report, the Consumer Behavioural Science report. You've got Steve Martin, who is going to be the first speaker here. He's a best-selling author. He is also Director of Influence at Work and has a background in consumer behavioural science. So he's the first speaker. Then we've got Bryn Anderson, who is an accountant. Sorry about that, but he's an accountant. He is going to be talking about a fascinating piece of analysis that he's done. His specialisation is in brands and brand valuation. And the second report, the longer report, which you're free to take upstairs if you haven't already got one, looks at the financial impact on lookalikes. Then you've got me. Sorry about that. That'll be a bit of law. And then finally, we have genuine rock star attraction in that we've got the godfather of the anti-lookalike movement, which is John Noble. He's going to be chairing the last session for us. Just a bit of background on that to show you the gravitas that John has. I qualified in 1994 as a solicitor, and that's relevant because that's when the Trademarks Act came in. That's why I'm a trademark lawyer, because I thought nobody else knew anything about that, so that's good enough for me, and here I still am. When I was qualifying, John was already spearheading the anti-lookalikes campaign, in fact had been for a year or two before that, and saw the legislation as an opportunity to do that. So we've got a wealth of knowledge in the room, so please do use it. I'd also like to thank Ips and Seb, who are at the back there. The two of them were very, very involved in the preparation of the Consumer Behavioural Science report as well. The final thank you, most surprising for me, is I'd like to thank Lidl for yesterday's judgment. We'll be talking about that. But actually, Lidl have given us a lovely authority that supports everything that we're saying on unfair advantage and actually opens the door for copyright claims as well. So we'll talk a bit about that, but thank you, Lidl. Now, before I hand over for the first, I just wanted to debunk a few myths. And this is what we're up against with lookalikes. This was something at the weekend. 6.8 million views from whoever Molly Goodfellow is, but she's obviously very popular. 6.8 million views on Twitter, asking how on earth do Aldi get away with that? Okay, this is the sort of misinformation and the misunderstanding that's out there amongst what I call social media and what Lidl's legal team call Vox Populi, which I think is Latin for social media. But the top one, it's all about confusion. No, it isn't. Next one, close enough, but different enough for the lawyer. Wrong, because we're going to be looking at link. It's definitely not different enough for lawyers. Next one, this is a standard one. Oh, they tolerate it because it's all produced in the same place. True in some cases, but not in most. Next one, this is a novel one. I hadn't actually seen this one before. It's a development of the last one. It's exactly the same product, and they just let them sell it with a different label on, and they get the money from it. No, wrong. It would be inappropriate of me to comment on the last one. They must have the best lawyers in the business. We've done a lot against Aldi. I'll leave it at that. Our first speaker then is going to be Steve, who is going to run through some fascinating insights as to how your brain works. But more importantly, this is really useful stuff to support the evidence that you need to actually get rid of lookalikes on unfair advantage claims. Steve.
Okay. Thank you, Geoff. This one?
Yep.
Can I have a clicker? Bless you, thank you. There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. This is the interactive bit. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much indeed, Geoff, and thank you to Stobbs for the kind invitation to speak a little bit about the report that they commissioned from us a few months ago, talk about some of the primary findings, and I'm looking forward very much to an interaction a little bit later on, answering some of your questions, getting involved in the debate. I am a social psychologist by training. I am not a lawyer, so I'm also looking forward to learning some things in your company this afternoon. The other thing I'd actually like to do is just add my recognition and thanks to my two colleagues, Ipsta Kula and Sebastian Rocker, both very accomplished behavioural psychologists. Ips from a consumer and applied behavioural science background, Yale graduates, LSE masters. Seb actually has that unique discipline where he actually trained as a lawyer and then retrained as a psychologist. So they both, I think, have lots of credibility, and in terms of their contribution to the report, it's really quite an important one. And so later on this afternoon, when the questions start, I think please do avail yourself of two other really brilliant experts in the room on the particular topic that we're going to be talking about this afternoon. So thank you both. I really appreciate it. So I've got maybe 12, 15 minutes to talk, and I wonder whether or not you might be willing to indulge me for the first few minutes at least, because I'd like to talk about turkeys. Specifically, I'd like to talk about mother turkeys. Now, mother turkeys, like many maternal creatures, are going to be very caring and very protective over their young. This is no surprise. It's evolutionary in nature. It should come as no shock to anyone that they are going to be highly protective over their chicks. What might surprise you, though, is the cue or the signal within the environment that they use to determine whether or not they activate those maternal behaviours and instincts. Turkey chicks make quite a unique cheep noise. And that is essentially the signal that mother turkeys use to determine whether or not they will care for them or not. If they are in the vicinity of turkey chicks and they hear the cheep, cheep, unique noise of that turkey chick, they will mother, they will care, they will protect it. Interestingly, if they are in the vicinity of turkey chicks and they do not hear this cheep noise, they will largely ignore that baby and in some instances even attack it. Okay, now, why am I talking about this? Well, go with me on this. There is a parallel to human behaviour. But one of the things that's really interesting about the turkey is its enemy in the natural world. So its natural enemy is a polecat. A polecat is rather like a weasel type of animal. And if you introduce a polecat into the vicinity of a turkey, particularly a mother turkey that has young chicks, you'll get that expected classic flight or fright response. She'll kind of step back, she'll start to jump up and down, she'll kind of fail her feathers, these kind of things, in order to kind of create that, stay away from me, that kind of protective nature. But what's particularly interesting is when you introduce a scheming ethologist into the situation. An ethologist is essentially a scientist that studies animal behavior. And their question obviously is going to be, well, what would happen if you introduced into the vicinity of a mother turkey a polecat and at the same time played the audio noise of a cheep cheep, which is similar to a baby turkey. In that instance, she's faced with this dilemma. I have an enemy in front of me that is actually making a noise that I associate with maternal instinct? What does the turkey do in that instance? And what she actually does is she embraces her enemy. She moves towards it, and she essentially uses that audio cue as a signal of, this is something that is close to me, it's similar to me, I therefore care for it. And in both animal behavior and more broadly my home discipline of social psychology, we call this a fixed action pattern. It's essentially a cue within the environment that leads us to quickly, automatically, largely unconsciously and reflexively make a decision. I see this, I act and I behave in this way. Okay. And it is important that we, at the beginning of this afternoon together, we talk about the relevance of fixed action patterns, not just to turkeys, but also to broader human behavior, and specifically in relation to this particular afternoon meeting, the behavior of consumers in supermarkets. Because the fact of the matter is that all of us as humans have our own fixed action patterns. Here's one example. A few years ago, we found a study of a tyre manufacturer, think Quick Fit, those kind of stores, who would routinely advertise offers in local newspapers and online, offering discounts for its tyres. Okay. Come into our store this weekend and buy 3 tyres, get the 4th for free. These kind of things. And it's a pretty good marketing strategy. It's not necessarily complicated. It certainly shouldn't be surprising that consumers react to these kind of things. But one thing that really kind of interested about this particular case was, due to a printing error one weekend, a local newspaper printed coupons for this tyre manufacturer, offering the very attractive 0% discount on all our tyres this weekend. The question we're going to ask is, what happened? In fact, the tyre shop itself went into a bit of a fit of apoplexy, started to contact the printer and saying, what have you done? You've kind of ruined our business this weekend. The fact of the matter is that they didn't really have worried at all, because just as many consumers turned up to the shop and to the garage that weekend with their coupon offering 0% discount. Because essentially when you see a coupon, you expect there to be some sort of offer or discount. It was the same fixed action pattern that a turkey mother uses to determine whether she cares for her young, but in this instance, it was selling tyres. Or, perhaps people just saw the coupon and thought that they were going cheap. Oh, come on, that was quite good, right? So what are the kind of fixed action patterns that we embrace in a supermarket context? And why do they work? Why is it that they are so central to our psychology, our behavior? And I think a good place to start is to think about your own lives. Just by way of a show of hands, what sort of time do you get up in the morning? Let's say those that are up before 6 a.m., okay, before 6:30, 7, 7:30. Okay, I won't go any further. And on that same day, what sort of time would you go to bed in the evening? Say 10, 10:30, 11. We've got some owls and larks in the room. Okay, so here's my question. Over the course of that typical 16 to 18 hours, how many times during that day are you going to be exposed to some form of stimulus, a piece of information, a message that seeks in some way to grab your attention, persuade you, buy this, do that, answer this email, think this, don't think that. Anyone interested in perhaps starting the bidding on this one? What do we think?
2,000.
Couple of thousand? Okay, this is a tough audience, isn't it? Well, it turns out that John's estimate 2,000, you say? Okay. I think you're largely right about that. With an exception, of course, a but. You would have been right in about 2007. Clearly now, many, many more. I teach at Columbia Business School. I have colleagues that look at this stuff, and I have 2 in particular that just have given up counting. That is the world that we live in today. the single most information overloaded, stimulus saturated environment that has ever existed on this planet. And the idea that all of us have that cognitive bandwidth, that mental capacity to think about every decision we make, take on board all the information that's presented to us, and start to think about what might be the right decision in this context. I mean, we simply cannot do that. Our life would be exhausting. And we find these stimulus-saturated environments wherever we go, wherever we're at work, and arguably one of the perhaps most hyper-stimulated environments is the supermarket. Thousands and thousands of stock-keeping units, thousands of different opportunities, visual appeals, products, all these different kind of things. The idea that a consumer, a shopper, a person, you, me, would go into a supermarket and start to explore and debate and essentially appraise all the different products that are available on the shelves and come to thoughtful, considered decisions about what the best toothpaste might be, what the best soap might be, what the best washing up liquid might be. I mean, it would be an exhausting experience. So what do we do instead? What we do is we rely on fixed action patterns, simple heuristics, rules of thumb that guide our decisions in a reliably accurate way. One of the things that we essentially are highly motivated to do as humans is to make the most accurate decision that we can in situations where we either don't have all the information to hand or we just don't have the cognitive bandwidth to assess all the information that is actually at hand. And that is essentially the central premise of the report that Ips, Seb and myself have authored on the psychology of lookalikes. What are the psychological factors, the reliable behavioral heuristics and rules of thumb that are being exploited in ways that essentially influence and persuade people to make decisions that, if perhaps they were able to step back and consider all of the attributes, the pros and cons of the offer, they perhaps might make a slightly different one. And our report largely comes to three conclusions. Okay. The first is that because of all these reasons of information overload and stimulus saturation, consumers typically don't make informed decisions all of the time. Certainly not always, and that includes us in this room as well. Influence is not something that simply happens to other people, it happens to all of us. And as much as we might have some interesting stories that we tell ourselves about how we are all very different to everyone else, and we wouldn't be fooled by these aspects, we wouldn't be influenced to make these decisions, the reality of the situation is, of course, we all are. The second thing that we actually found in our research, and this seems to go against the grain of the received and used wisdom in the judicial system, is that brand names, trademarks are the most important thing when consumers decide whether they pick product A over product B, product C over product D. That's simply not the case. That is a misunderstanding. It's an inaccurate assessment. We find considerable bodies of research now that show that there's a clear priority in terms of what consumers look for in terms of a fixed action pattern to decide whether or not they're going to pick something up and put it in their basket. Okay, color, shape, packaging are significantly more influential and significantly more reliable in terms of automatic cues that consumers use. And certainly the brand name itself pales in significance compared to those things. And the final thing is that an individual shopper's or consumer's perspective or belief or previous experience of a brand product is highly predictive in actually influencing their perspectives of other similar looking like products. We have this halo effect. In psychology, the halo effect is a pretty reliable function that has been studied for well over 100 years now, that essentially says that if we see something with a certain set of attributes, it's very easy to see something that's similar as essentially possessing similar attributes, often the same attributes. So by copying some of the reliable colours and shapes of well-known brands, imitation brands, mimics, essentially have that ability to kind of trade off of that positive halo effect in that instance. So that's largely what we find in the report. What I wanted to do now is give you a couple of examples in terms of the specifics, because there is no doubt that as humans, we are hardwired for difference. And there's a very good reason for that. If we in an information overloaded world are wired to notice difference, we are essentially wired to notice threats. Okay? In the olden days, warring tribes that would come towards our villages flying flags, if we saw the flag as the same as ours, we would open the gates and welcome them in. If we saw that their coat of arms or flag was different to ours, that's a warning sign, that's a threat. That's not a friend coming, that is a foe on its way. Let's shut the gates, let's protect ourselves in those instances. Another example is food. Fruit is a good example. There are certain colours of fruit that allow us to know that it is ripe and that it is ready to be eaten. Food of a different colour might signal difference, might signal a warning sign that might actually be a threat to us in that instance. So notice that because we are so hardwired for difference, if you want to kind of ride in the slipstream of a brand, making yourself as similar as possible is a pretty smart and clever move, certainly from a psychological perspective, because of that aspect of being wired for difference. Okay? Being wired for difference is also important from a contrast perspective. Another way in which we quickly decide to make decisions is not to look at all the information available to us, but to look briefly, often within milliseconds at environment, and determine by comparison what is the right judgment, what is the wrong judgment. I'll give you an example. If you want to appear tall in a bar, it certainly helps to have short friends. Again, no response. Now, what's really interesting about this idea of contrast effects is when you start to put two products together side by side, an original brand next to a copycat. The first thing that you see, or more importantly in the context of the psychology of product lookalikes, the thing that you are most familiar with becomes the reference point. And that's really, really important to think about. For example, you are unlikely to look at these two men and go, look at that guy on the left. He looks remarkably like Ibrahim Ilham, who is a portrait wedding photographer from Jakarta, Indonesia. You don't think that. You already have a ready set of reference points in mind. Okay? And the same is true when you think about lookalike products. It's highly unlikely, I suspect, that a consumer would look at the product on the right and go, the product on the left and go, look at that Head and Shoulders thing. It's exactly like Lacura anti-dandruff shampoo. That doesn't happen. That's not the way that the actual world works. So not only is the similarity playing into this advantage, or in this case, unfair advantage, the order in which they are operating also has that effect as well. One last thing before I hand back to Geoff is to also consider the following, that when it comes to us making judgments about how consumers make judgments, this difference is also apparent, okay? Given that a few moments ago I claimed that it's unlikely that the majority of consumers going into a supermarket are going to be thinking carefully, sequentially, systematically about each product they actually buy, that's not the case at all. We make decisions in a matter of milliseconds, largely based on unconscious cues. So when we ask the judicial system to evaluate whether or not a product is claiming an unfair advantage or not, that seems to be a little bit screwed up, because we are essentially asking someone to spend weeks and weeks and weeks to think deeply about the merits of a decision that's made in a matter of milliseconds. that's entirely inconsistent with how the decision is actually made. If we want judges to actually make decisions based on evidence and information about how consumers actually make decisions, they surely need to make those decisions in exactly the same context. We're going to sit here for 2 hours this afternoon and talk about the psychology, the economics, and the governing law of lookalikes. One thing that I'd advise that we actually do and have front of mind as we have this conversation is we are thinking about this in a way that no consumer, no shopper is ever going to think about in this way. So there is that sense of an inconsistency. Okay? Essentially, if you think about from a decision-making perspective, there's a theory within decision-making. We call it the dual processing theory. It's this idea that you essentially have two brains. I mean, it's a metaphor. You don't have two brains, but you do have two ways of processing information. The first is kind of what I call fast thinking. It's kind of automatic. It's quick. It's reflexive. What's interesting about this system one approach as well is it's always turned on. It's the part of the brain that allows you to know to put your hands in front of you as you're falling down without actually having to think about putting your hands in front of you to protect you when you're falling down. Okay. There's another part, of course, of our processing system that is a lot more reflective. It requires us to kind of think and ponder about things. The problem, of course, with this part of the brain is that it takes time, it takes energy, it consumes glucose. It's a very effortful way of thinking, and it's certainly not conducive to the supermarket context. And so in this instance, this thinking about how we make judgments and this idea that we expect judgments to be made in a rational, considered way, but what we're judging here is a largely unconscious, automatic, super quick way of thinking. That seems to be incredibly inconsistent, and something that I hope that the evidence in this particular report actually addresses and needs to be addressed, along with that idea of trademarks, brand names being actually sub-important when it comes to more important aspects such as colour and packaging. So I'll leave you with this idea. If it looks like a duck and it swims like a duck, then it's a duck. But you've probably seen this rather infamous German psychological image trick. Sometimes it's not a duck, but that doesn't detract from this abductive reasoning that lookalikes, mimics seek to exploit when it comes to influencing consumer decisions. Geoff.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks very much. Before I introduce Bryn, thanks, Steve. Just a couple of closing comments on that section from me. One of the things that I've really enjoyed working with Steve and his team looking at this is realising actually how wrong lawyers have been getting this. So the last point there about a lot of consumers don't know themselves the decisions they're making. What do as lawyers? We ask the consumers. We do surveys of consumers. Now, this for me calls into question what is the value of that? This is all automatic. What they're saying is not what they're actually doing. That's the first point. The second point, and for those who follow the fun that I have in LinkedIn, apologies because you'll have seen this example, but putting it in a legal context, in terms of the advantage that is taken of the marketing function of the packaging, which is capable of being a trademark. Look at the example of trying to find your mother at a train station at rush hour at Waterloo. How are you going to find her? Are you going to find her because you'll recognise her face in the thousands of people that are walking across? Are you going to find her because she's branded, by which I mean she's got a badge with mum on? Or are you going to find her because she's got the familiar red hat on? Well, there's your heuristic, there's your mental shortcut. That's how you find her. Colour attracts you in a way that nothing else does. In a supermarket context, I did this myself as a challenge to see, having read Steve's report, to see if it's how my brain worked. I went in and then thought, I'm going to find Vaseline. Okay? I know it'll be in personal health care. I can't read anything from the bottom of that section of the supermarket. If it had had petroleum jelly written on it, I wouldn't have seen it. My mind knows exactly what, it's a distinctive package, see-through, it's nothing else like it. Straight to it. It takes you seconds to find this stuff. That's where the advantage comes in. That's the abuse of the marketing function. When you get there, if you see a lookalike beside it, you're only there because they've abused the marketing function. So we'll look at that in a bit more detail when we get to the law. But the impact of the findings on Steve, and I would recommend you this report, but importantly for the lawyers amongst the room, the last 4 pages are probably for the lawyers the most important part of the report, because that's where all the original research is. There's an entire bibliography of where all of this stuff comes from if you find yourself having to rely on it at court. So thank you again for that, Steve. I'm going to hand over to Bryn now, who is going to look at another area which is a revelation for certainly the lawyers in the room, the financial impact that this has if brands are targeted by lookalike manufacturers. Bryn.
Thank you, Geoff. It's an absolute pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to you and take you through the study that we've done over the last month or two. Let me just put this in here. Okay, is that okay? When I was asked by Geoff to look into this lookalikes exercise, from a personal perspective, I was obviously being confronted by lookalikes on a personal level, obviously aware of them and been sort of confronted by them, over the years. So it was really quite a fascinating thing to look into from a personal perspective. As Geoff said, the angle that we took was looking at the scale or the valuation impact on business and on brand value, as well as brand equity. But before I get into the findings of the study, by way of background, so my name's Bryn. I'm a director at Valuation Consulting. At Valuation Consulting, we specialise in the valuation of businesses, portfolio investments and shareholdings. We also specialise in the valuation of intangible assets and IP, including brand and trademark. I head up, as Geoff alluded to, VC brand, one of the 4 core areas that at Valuation Consulting we focus on. So I'm leading the trademark brand related valuation work, be it for commercial, financial, tax, and also legal or litigation support purposes. But equally, and I'm joined by some of my fellow directors here that head up the likes of VC Tech, so that's sort of tech-related IP and business valuation exercises. We also have VC Expert, which is our valuations for expert witness type engagements. And then lastly, VC Attestation, which is largely our accounting, tax and regulatory type valuation work. So the fact that we focus primarily on, well, specifically on valuations, means that we don't offer legal advice, tax advice, we don't do audit services. So we're able to come from a position of offering completely independent, impartial, and arm's length advice, which is obviously quite appreciated by our clients as well. And because of the size of our firm and the sort of the makeup of our firm, we're extremely agile, responsive, and also cost effective, certainly when you compare it to some of the larger accounting firms, including the Big Four. And in terms of the team, as Geoff mentioned, we're chartered accountants in terms of background, but the wide range of the team certainly comes to VC from various areas of expertise, interests, and experience, brand in my case. The last point is that we're members and registered to RICS, so we have to adhere to the regulations of RICS accreditation, and we're also part of VRG, or the Valuation Research Group, which is an international cohort of valuation firms and thought leaders. So that's us in terms of the background. So, like I mentioned, coming into this was absolutely sort of fascinating exercise for me. It's a really interesting angle to look at brand value and business value and the impact in the market of lookalikes. So it's completely fascinating. And it's just a pleasure to be part of this conversation here today. So before I go into the findings and looking at the valuation specifics, if we sort of step back and look at the lookalikes markets, well, Lookalike supermarkets, when I say that, I think we're thinking about the likes of Aldi and Lidl. Well, they've seen extraordinary growth over the last few years. Aldi and Lidl growing like 24 and 22% in the last financial year, respectively. And that's certainly a lot faster than the other UK supermarkets. So much so that Aldi is now the 4th largest supermarket in the UK. So what is driving this? Well, customers are increasingly being lured to value supermarkets, and this is only going to continue or accelerate as we move through the cost of living crisis that we find ourselves in. And so it's a lure to the value and the value proposition. And the research sort of suggests this. There was some research done earlier this year that actually showed what we're seeing through those sales figures, that consumers are actually changing the way that they shop and how they're actually changing their behaviours going to value supermarkets. But more importantly, they're explicitly saying that they're moving away from original brands to the own brand, including lookalike alternatives. So what's driving this value proposition? Well, to a large extent, it's the behaviour of lookalikes. And this isn't so much of a marketing gimmick, but this is a deep-seated business strategy that's being adopted by Aldi and Lidl. You know, trying to change the perceptions of the consumers into believing that these own brand and lookalike equivalents share similar characteristics. And the point was just made previously, be it taste, flavour, quality, texture, or even source of innovation. And through changing these perceptions in the eye of the consumer, it's really sort of driving this notion that Aldi, Lidl, and their own brand equivalents are a reasonable and sensible alternative, a lower cost equivalent. And it seems to be working. If you look at the chart down the bottom right of the screen here, what this is addressing through the research I referred to earlier is looking at the differential in the quality perception of products. So in the eyes of the consumer, if one was to look at the quality perception between the original brand and the own brand or lookalike equivalents, that gap in quality perception has never been lower. 30% in the study from earlier this year, only 30% of the respondents actually said that the quality of the original brand is superior to the own brand or lookalike equivalent. That suggests that the other 70% believe that the own brand or lookalike equivalent is of equal quality, if not, I guess in many cases, superior quality. So you can see that there's this general trend here, and it just stands to reason that the influence of lookalikes is really driving this up. And there's also research that sort of suggests that 70% of UK consumers are actually shopping around for price, and that stands to reason. Like I mentioned, the cost of living crisis and the changing behaviours of consumers. And Aldi is now the #1 value supermarket in the eyes of the UK consumer. So it seems to be working. And the UK supermarkets, you know, over the years have been biting back, and they have been trying to play them at their own game in terms of driving that value perception. I think Geoff mentioned it earlier in terms of the Lidl promotions, and up until yesterday been using, the Tesco Club Card had been sort of having the same sort of brand imagery as Lidl to try to communicate that position of value. And also Sainsbury's and Tesco running the Aldi price match promotions as well, just goes to show that they're reinforcing the notion that Aldi really is a viable brand alternative, but equally they're just further promoting Aldi as the value alternative. So that was sort of the market sort of background. But the question for me is, at what cost? What is the impact of all of this on the original brands in the UK across the UK consumer goods category? Now, the place that we started to address this was to think, okay, well, let's have a look at an original brand operating in the UK market. And fortunately, with the sort of collaboration and with the parent company with this brand, which I'm extremely thankful, we're able to receive some good financial information, brand information, cost information, which allowed us, as a starting point, establish a baseline and analyse an original brand currently operating in the UK consumer goods market. So let me tell you a little bit about it. It's operating in the non-alcoholic beverage brand. We're going to refer to it as Brand X for obvious reasons. It has sales of around 60 million, 2022, and sort of constant growth throughout, following a period of sort of downturn revenues over the COVID crisis. Over the decades, it's built up an extremely strong brand strength or brand equity. So we assessed the strength of this particular brand in our proprietary brand strength assessment framework, effectively a balanced scorecard of brand performance metrics, and we derived a brand strength score of 83 out of 100. Another way of expressing that is a AAA minus brand. It's effectively like thinking about the brand in terms of like a credit rating, but it's a brand rating. So it's an extremely strong brand, extremely strong presence and prominence in the UK markets, completely distinct, and really strong equity. It's not actually combating lookalikes in the UK market, which made it a really good base case effectively. So none of the lookalike impacts were sort of baked into this baseline valuation of this brand. So once we have that, the idea is then we can sort of think about and try and sort of simulate or model the likely impact of lookalikes should they enter the market on this brand. So the starting point was to put a valuation on the business, the Brand X Inc., as we're calling it. So the overarching business which operates under the Brand X trademark. We used a discounted cash flow method, and I won't get into the technicalities of that, but we put it at a value of 105 million sterling. We then put a valuation on the Brand X brand, defined as the trademark and the associated marketing IP. We used a method called relief from royalty. Many of you may have heard or be familiar with this income-based method, which is effectively trying to derive the brand earnings relating to Brand X over a forecast horizon and into perpetuity. We derived a value of 37.5 million for the value of the Brand X brand. So once we'd established the valuation of Brand X, we've established the strength of Brand X and also the value of the business, it was a really good sort of platform then to sort of introduce like a simulation. So to start thinking about the impacts of lookalikes should they enter the market, and what are the likely effects on Brand X in terms of its brand health, brand value, and business value. We used a 6-year forecast time horizon representing the income-based valuation explicit forecast period, and we also looked into perpetuity on the basis that the brand will be around beyond a 6-year lifetime. So what did we look at and what did we find? So in summary format, you can see that in the screen in front of you, and I'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail later. But the first finding was that through the introduction of lookalikes, thinking about top-line sales performance of Brand X, on average, over the 6-year horizon, sales would fall by 7%. Now, the first thing to bear in mind is that this is an average sales, and so as the introduction of lookalikes sort of gains momentum, there's like an incremental effect over the 6 years, and so therefore there's a compound effect on the impact of Brand X sales over the 6-year period. So I think the point is, at the end of year 6, the actual reduction in sales is higher than the 7%. That equated to £28 million over that period, pretty much half of the 1-year sales of Brand X in 2022. So I think one of the questions there on sales is, okay, but so to what extent, if Brand X was then to sort of sell into the likes of Lidl and Aldi, to what extent could that or would that compensate for this sort of loss? And I think the first point is, would they want to? And, to what point is that actually building brand X brand? It's a market leader, it's a category leader. We're enjoying a huge amount of brand equity. And so the first thing is strategically is, does that make sense to go into these type of these supermarkets? But even they did, to what extent would that sort of offset the type of sort of loss that we've seen here? And the other point is, it's not unreasonable for brand X, and I'll make this point further on in the presentation as well, it's not unreasonable for brand X to think that they should consider going into these type of supermarkets, but also, also not being realised the detrimental impact of lookalikes. This thing is not mutually exclusive. I think they should be reasonably expecting to go into these type of supermarkets if they choose to, like they do other supermarkets, because that is their business model, but not have the incremental impact of this sort of loss in value from it. And I think so, we should be working together to be able to create that environment where, if appropriate, that is a thing that they should be doing. But I'll talk about the underlying revenue impact on the next slide. The other area that we looked at was the likely cost profile, and specifically the incremental cost of combating lookalikes that brand X would be expected to incur. The extent to which, I'll go through in a couple of slides. But what I was thinking about was the impact possibly on brand packaging. And perhaps the necessity or the pressures that brand X would come under through, having to retain its distinctiveness in the marketplace that enjoys the irritation of having lookalikes and the impact that that will have on its brand packaging, and therefore the incremental costs associated. We looked at the product innovation as well. So we've seen earlier this perception gap on product quality. With the lookalike of brand X, is there a heightened sense or motivation to actually invest further in product innovation? Also bearing in mind that you can't, I guess, innovate too far, because you need to be true to your consumers and what they expect in terms of your product. But that was another cost that we looked at. In addition, there's likely to be, certainly if there's going to be a sort of repackaging or some changes under packaging, some brand marketing, advertising and promotion that goes along with combating lookalikes as well, to retain that distinctiveness that they have in the market and their brand equity. And lastly, around the brand monitoring and protection, in order to sort of account for this introduction of another competitive threat in the marketplace, and over and above the existing investment on brand monitoring, what would be the likely cost on top of that to account for this change being the introduction of lookalikes. We also addressed the likelihood of the impacts affecting brand equity performance. So you saw earlier the score of 83 out of 100 or a AAA, and I'll show you the benchmarking framework we utilized. But effectively what we were looking to do was understand on which of the brand performance attributes would be likely to be affected by the lookalikes, thus driving brand equity down, and then compounded with the lost branded sales on the top line, what would the overarching performance or value at risk be to the brand? And we calculated 18% at a value of 7 million. Then lastly, a combination of cost and top line performance obviously has an impact on the overarching value of the business that we did via a DCF. And we saw that the value of 105 million was likely to come down into in the region of 91 million, a reduction of 13%. So these are all material amounts. Now, it's obviously worth recognizing that this is a particular brand, and then obviously there's differentials between other brands operating in different categories, different levels of equity in its marketplace, sort of the scale of the business, the type of supermarkets that they may be sort of combating lookalikes. So it is variable. But for this particular brand, it's really quite compelling to see the absolute deltas that we're thinking about here. So let's have a look at the sales in a bit more detail. So you can see here the sales forecast that were modelled, and the green at the top sort of represents the sort of the revenue at risk, effectively. But I think lookalikes that can successfully change the perceptions or have perceptions in consumers' minds that they share similar characteristics as the original brand. And like I mentioned before, whether that's taste or quality, source of innovation, or that they share similar values, well, it stands to reason that the consumer is unlikely to be wanting to, pay a premium for the original brand if they're perceiving the value in the alternative. So it's likely that they're going to be moving to the lookalike or the own brand equivalent, but also over the long term as well. As far as lookalikes can be thought of by consumers as being a viable brand or product alternative, then that certainly represents, in many cases, a lost customer. And a lost customer to a lookalike or an own brand equivalent, where the perception is that they're getting equivalent value, but at a lower price. It can be quite expensive to pull that customer back in, even if you do bring them back in at all. Equally, we looked at the direct impact on brand X in terms of, I mentioned before, it's a market leader. It's had a considerable amount of investment in terms of building that brand over a sustained period of time. It has considerable brand value. The introduction of a lookalike in the marketplace it's reasonable to assume that would erode its distinctiveness, its brand equity. There'd be sort of like all of the impacts I mentioned before in terms of brand equity, well, many of them is likely to be brought down and eroded. And so if brand equity, an overarching reputation of brand X in the eyes of the UK consumer market is to come down, then that's likely to have an impact on overall sort of brand consideration, brand preference, and brand usage of brand X over the years. And that type of thing is to be combated to a large extent with those cost items that I mentioned earlier. So what we did was we actually used a lot of the data provided by the parent company that looked at the overarching brand equity scores over a period of time across all the attributes, and we found really strong correlations between the brand equity performance and overarching brand consideration across the category, and specifically brand X, and then looked at relationships between the consideration and market share performance as well. So what we were able to do was, with a sort of 5% reduction in brand equity performance, we're able to sort of model a 3% reduction in market share performance in year one, and then that was compounded as we went forward over the 6-year period. So thinking about the costs in a little bit more detail, starting with product packaging. Well, manufacturers, as many of you will sort of attest to, invest considerable amounts in the packaging of their product to create the memorable packaging and other sort of related assets. And I think the point is the presence of lookalikes is more than a mild irritation, and it's highly likely that firms will see that as an opportunity or a necessity to tweak, amend their brand packaging, and at incremental cost, and over and above the normal cycle of brand redesign and so on. There's examples. There was some research done many years ago. An executive of Muller, I believe, was quoted, and I paraphrase, to say that for a particular line of their products, they typically redo the packaging or make tweaks to the packaging every 2 to 3 years, and that is in direct response to competitors and the actions they're taking to show similarities in packaging. So there is evidence there, and at least it's a case of just getting into the mindset and understanding that there may be a necessity to change that packaging, and at what cost. So we had a look at the actual spend of brand X in terms of their product packaging design, and factored that in to our calculation. The next one is around product innovation, and I alluded to it earlier. I think obviously there's a drive to stay ahead of the competitors in terms of these products, and I think the introduction of lookalikes, and we've seen before how this perception of quality gap is really quite narrow. There may be an inclination or a motivation to actually address that quality gap, retain that product uniqueness, and its place in the market, and that would be at incremental cost as well. There is a chain of thought, but if you're spending more on innovation, isn't that a good thing? And I guess to some extent it is, but I think what that doesn't necessarily account for is sort of wasted innovation, the necessity to sort of over-innovate and to do additional innovation, in part to respond to lookalikes, and what does that sort of come to? And I mentioned before, there's naturally sort of some close sort of boundaries which one can innovate, because you don't want to be innovating the product too far away from its existing product, because you've got to bear in mind the demands and needs of your end consumer. But we had a look at the product innovation costs of brand X, and we factored in sort of 20% of that annual expense as incremental for brand innovation in response to lookalikes. And then, of course, I mentioned before, there's brand marketing. So if there is going to be some redesign or change to product packaging, it stands to reason that will go along with some launch, and there'll be some brand exposure and communication. Over and above that, on an annual basis, there may be some additional investment or for brand X, considering the introduction of lookalikes to try and distance itself away or heighten awareness of it within its particular category. So we estimated 200k per annum at 10 to 20% of the annual marketing spend, and we think that was relatively conservative. The last thing to think about was protection of the investment. So, stands to reason in one way, shape or form, brand owners or brand managers will be tracking the performance and possibly the value of their brands, whether it's through Net Promoter Score or brand tracker studies, or looking at sort of, the overarching sort of marketing funnel metrics. There's many ways to obviously do this. But the point is, with the introduction of lookalikes as another threat and something else to consider, there may be a necessity, and I would argue that there would be and there should be a necessity to amend that brand performance monitoring to take into account the effects of lookalikes, the impact it's having on your brand relative to competitors, and how it's sort of shifting the dial. So I think all of this sort of stuff around monitoring and protection has to come at as an incremental cost. Now, sure, brand X may not, in this case, invest additional costs to innovate on packaging or in product, or spend any additional marketing or advertising investment to address lookalikes. And that be the case, that's a decision to be made. But then if that is not the case, but then to what extent, if they're not taking those corrective measures, would the top line sales be impacted? I would argue if they're not making these additional incremental investments, then they're likely to see additional loss in top sales. The last one is the brand value and brand strength. So we looked at the brand value, and the starting point was to assess the strength of the brand. And we did that on this balanced scorecard framework, which is proprietary to Valuation Consulting. And we look at the strength of the brand in three core areas, really, sort of inputs and actions. So these are sort of, these are activities that brand managers and the businesses can actually take, levers they can pull in terms of influencing the brand. And then following that is the audience effects. So following those sort of investments and those activities that you can take, let's think about strength of the brand in terms of the eyes of the audience or the consumer. Hopefully that bit in the middle is affected by the actions you take at the top. And then the last section at the bottom is really commercial performance. So I think when one is assessing the strength of a brand X in this case, it's really important to understand the more hard-nosed performance measures, be it revenue, profitability, growth, risk and control, licensing, strength, and so on. So I think the basic premise is thinking about it like a brand investor. So if you're investing in a brand, you'd want to understand it's being invested in properly, it's thought of highly in regards to its audiences, and also it's performing. So we did this assessment for brand X, and we derived a score of 83, like I mentioned earlier. So to model the impact from lookalikes, what we attempted to do, and of course we would need this sort of empirical research to be able to, to understand the true differential or the true sort of impact on a number of these measures. But we just put like a half-point reduction on the metrics we thought would be likely affected by the impact of lookalikes, and you can see that with the red marks there. And for instance, under brand attitudes, there's a higher score, and that if we drill down into that is where we're able to see the performance of brand X on some fundamental brand equity drivers, and we did a similar exercise for that and aggregated it up, and then you can see there there's like a 1.93 reduction of their original score. So effectively it comes down by 5%, which is reasonably conservative, I would imagine, from the effect of lookalikes. But again, we're doing it for illustrative purposes. The result of that would drop brand value by 7%, 18% to tune of 7 million off the top of brand X brand value. Yeah. Okay. So you can see here, this is the valuation of the business. Went down from 105 million to 91. You can see the impact of the two fundamental drivers: revenue impact, reducing the value of the business by 10 million, and then the cost impact to the tune of 4 million. So conclusions from our study is the scale of the impact is too large to ignore. Based on this one, and it will be variable from different brands, but I think it gives a true sense of the scale. The model of lookalikes is driving the growth of the discount supermarkets in the UK. That's only set to continue. I think the exposure of lookalikes and the impact of lookalikes amongst consumers is only set to increase. Certainly over the cost of living crisis. Doing nothing risks brands sleepwalking into a longer term brand value creation harm. And like I mentioned before, once you lose consumers to own brand equivalents or lookalikes, they're extremely expensive to bring back, even if you do get the opportunity to do that. For my view, it's about creating tracking research or updating existing tracking research to be able to fundamentally track the impact of lookalikes on your brands as part of your existing brand tracking framework, understand the value of your brands and the value at risk and the value erosion so you can take corrective or course correction measures, and therefore having a provision for a budget to address all the things I've been talking about I think is really, really important. And the last point is, I alluded to it earlier, these things are not mutually exclusive. It's not about pulling out or not going in, selling into the likes of Aldi and Lidl. These brands should be able to do that, but they should equally not have to deal with the impact of lookalikes as well. They should be able to create an environment where they should be able to do that rather than just being win-win for the likes of Aldi and Lidl. And at that wraps up my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Bryn. Again, just a couple of closing comments on that section. I think there's two things that modelling like that is really important for. In our experience, there's often a tension between the legal team, the IP team, that want to take action against lookalikes, and the commercial team who would quite like to supply Aldi because it goes towards their bonus apart from anything else. So there is a tension there. Now, as long as this sort of evaluation is being done within big brands and they're working out that actually it is or it isn't worth taking on the lookalikes, that's fine. But in my experience, that sort of analysis isn't being done. The second thing to bear in mind when we're looking at sort of packaging trademark claims is we're focusing today on unfair advantage, but also if it is detrimental to the trademark, it gives you a claim as well. And this sort of modelling that Bryn and his team have put together is a really useful for device evidentially to actually show the financial impact. And again, that's not something the courts have been looking at when they're considering detriment. So there's a lot more that can be done in terms of evidencing these claims financially. I'm going to get into the legal background now, and I started by saying that we don't like lookalikes at Stobbs. One of the reasons we don't like them is because we spend our whole lives looking after brands. It's a fairly untraditional firm. I won't get into too much background about the firm because I think most of you know us. But we look at everything from brand creation, brand protection, brand valuation. We look at counterfeiting. We look at infringement. Everything we do is brand. And the fact that the UK market seems to have got itself into the position where lookalikes are not only tolerated but regarded as a bit of harmless fun by a lot of consumers is concerning, which is why we're trying to do something about it and just change people's perception of actually why these claims are important. Now, leaving aside the financial impact that Bryn's been talking about, what are they doing in legal terms when they mimic the packaging? Well, we've already spoken about with Steve, it's effectively a benchmarking exercise. Aldi themselves go on record as saying, we'll do the same but different. What does that mean? It means getting as close as possible to the brand so that it is recognised and has all of the impact that Steve's been talking about in terms of getting you to the product and buying the product. But it doesn't cause confusion. They've done a very good job of that. Confusion claims are very difficult to succeed upon in the UK because we have a very sophisticated lookalikes, a discount supermarket sector where people know about lookalikes. They know what they are. You might get some confusion evidence, but it's very difficult and it's very expensive. So that's their objective essentially, is to avoid confusion. But that isn't good enough. And the way that the cases are going at the moment, confusion should never be the driving. I'm going to look at some of the right way to run these claims. Lawyers are obsessed with confusion. They throw in passing off claims. They throw in Section 10.2 likelihood of confusion claims. Why? Because they were brought up to do it. It's the wrong claim to bring for lookalikes for reasons that I'll go on to explore. But the whole model that Aldi and Lidl and others have tried to operate is to make sure, firstly, they don't cause confusion for a passing off or 10.2 claim, and secondly, so that they don't infringe copyright. That's essentially what their model is. But the way the law is going on, Unfair Advantage and Link, they've got a real problem. It's worth bearing in mind, just briefly, a quick history lesson. Aldi, when they came to the UK, their proposition was they wanted to sell German products in the UK. They thought the UK would like German products, and they wanted to do it at a discount. They found quite quickly that us Brits are quite xenophobic, didn't like German stuff, so they had to rethink, how do we do discount products in the UK? The answer is we sell UK products. Well, how do we sell UK products? We mimic. So the whole model is based on this stuff, and there's a reason for it. We've spoken, I won't dwell on the stuff that Steve's already covered, but a lot of this is to essentially get you to buy the product, and they go for the key elements of the brand. Their model is essentially, we'll take most of the key elements of the brand, but we'll stay away from the name. And we'll give a very different name. I don't know if people buy confectionery products in Aldi, but their Mars equivalent, Titan. Their Twix equivalent, Jive. They think that's good enough because it's a different name. Wrong. So what are they actually doing? Way back to L'Oreal, which is a good 20 years old, the Courts of Justice said there are a number of things that trademarks do. They guarantee origin. Yes, we all knew that. That was the traditional view. But also they have an advertising, marketing and investment function, and that's what they're exploiting. So they're essentially all the stuff that Steve's been talking about this attraction, the transfer of quality, all of the rest of it, that's what's being abused by the lookalikes. That is trademarkable. It's your packaging. I'll come on to how to go about protecting it and then enforcing it. But it is all free riding on trademarks, which gives you a claim for unfair advantage. And as a result, there's evidence to support this, they charge a higher price. So I don't know if anybody remembers Fine Fare, but Fine Fare are a supermarket long gone. Their lookalikes used to be all yellow. Their own brand products were all yellow. So baked beans were yellow, biscuits were yellow, and they had the name on them. Unsurprisingly, that wasn't very popular amongst consumers. For all of these reasons, you didn't know what they were, you couldn't distinguish them, you couldn't find them, you had to go and read the tin to see what it was. That's why they are exploiting the advertising and marketing function because they get you there. Once you're there, you get the transfer of image, the transfer of quality, and you're buying it because you think it's an equivalent. That is abusing the marketing function that the trademark achieves. A bit of law. This is all very well established law. Nothing we are talking about today is changing the law. It's just suggesting the right way to run lookalike claims. So this is just a summary of what the law says an unfair advantage claim consists of. The interesting parts, there's a lot of tedious bits in there which apply to all trademark claims. The interesting part is, firstly, you've got to have a trademark with a reputation. I would suggest that if the supermarkets are mimicking a product, the product's packaging already has that reputation. So that is easy when you're talking about packaging. Think of a Mars bar. The next one is there has to be a link between the products. This is why confusion cases are not the way to go. Lidl versus Tesco yesterday, the judgment came out. 102-page judgment. Congratulations to the Lidl legal team for the volume of evidence that they put in on that case. About 80 pages of the judgment are analysing the confusion evidence. 6 pages, unfair advantage found. These are straightforward claims. Why people are insisting on running confusion claims, I don't know. It's a lower bar, unfair advantage. All you have to show is link. You do not have to show confusion. So wasting a lot of legal fees in running confusion when the bar is this low on unfair advantage seems to me to benefit only the lawyers. So link is very easy. You simply have to show people make the connection. Now going back to the vox publici, is that what it was? The Latin term that was used in the Lidl case yesterday. Social media has got all of this evidence. Link is all over social media. Everybody comments on it. Everybody says, isn't this really funny? Look at that lookalike. They know what it is. There's your link evidence. The advantage has got to be unfair, and it's got to be without due cause. That's all the stuff in the statute. The box on the right is the way that the law has developed it through case law. So you won't find this in the statute. You'll find it in all of the cases, including yesterday's judgment. This just gets trotted out now because it's the law. You don't need confusion. I just mentioned that. Link, all it has to do is call to mind the packaging. That's the whole purpose of lookalikes. That's what they're deliberately doing, is calling to mind the earlier mark. Who has to call it to mind? The average consumer. Who is the average consumer? All of us in a supermarket. So if consumers, one of the problems that you always have when you're looking at sort of online evidence, Google type evidence, comments the consumer's making is, well, is that a comment from the relevant consumer? You know, can I give that any weight? When you talk about supermarkets and FMCGs, the answer to that is yes, because we are all consumers of supermarkets. So if they're calling it to mind, and they are all over the internet, they are calling to mind the lookalikes, normally in a way that they're saying, isn't this hilarious? There's your link. Transfer of image, easy. That's what Steve was talking about. Transfer of image is this abuse of the marketing function. So it's the packaging that has got you there. It's because you recognise the packaging that you're comfortable with it. You associate it with another product that you know very well, and you give it the same attributes. It's just cheaper. That's how it works. That is transfer of image. Go back to the fine fair yellow packaging, no transfer of image. Doesn't have anywhere near the benefit to the supermarket because people don't buy it. It's the transfer of image that causes people to buy the lookalikes. Change in economic behaviour. I'm going to look at a few cases. Change in economic behaviour you have to show, by which I mean you either have to show that you, the brand owners, consumers, are somehow behaving differently as a result of this. Might be that they're going across to the lookalike. Very difficult to show. Very easy to show is that the consumers of the lookalike supermarket are changing their behaviour because there are lookalikes available. And I'll look at a couple of authorities, but again, that is very easy, to establish because it's the whole reason for doing lookalikes. This is the transfer point. Consumers trust it. They're familiar with it. It's got the positive feeling. That's what's being hijacked. That is the unfair advantage that is being taken of the marketing function. So, I promised a couple of cases. This is in IPEC. Again, why these sorts of claims are being brought in the High Court, I do not know, including yesterday's case. Admittedly, the size of the parties, High Court's probably why they end up there. But in terms of simplicity, there is nothing to these cases. Claridge's, very well-known hotel. Court held that they had a reputation in hotel services and luxury. That wide. They've got a reputation in luxury. Okay? Claridge, I don't know if people see that. The candle says Claridge, London. Okay? The background to this, it was a fairly small operation based in Gillingham. And the lady who decided to set up the candles lived on a street called Claridge Road. She was looking at an appropriate brand. Her original choice was waxy candles. I kid you not. She probably decided that wasn't distinctive enough, certainly if she was looking at trademarks, so she moved away from waxy candles. What did she go to? Well, her daughter said to her, well, we live on Claridge Road. Why don't you call it Claridge Candles? Because she liked the repeat of C. So the mother thought, well, yeah, that's quite good. Claridge. We'll go for Claridge London. Because people, and I kid you not, this is in the evidence, her evidence was she didn't think foreign customers would know Gillingham. So she put London. Remarkably, that evidence wasn't challenged. But where they got to on the evidence is the court took the view whether or not, and that's the quote at the top, whether or not you were intending to free ride, the impact is you are free riding. Now, that's well established already. You don't need to intend to take unfair advantage. It helps. And obviously the likes of Aldi and Lidl are absolutely intending. But you don't even have to intend to take unfair advantage. So in this case, unchallenged, the evidence that it was because people didn't know where Gillingham was, and it was Claridge Road. But the judge took the view, luxury, these are quasi-luxury products, you're going to be able to charge more for them for the fact that you're putting Claridge on the candle and the fact you're putting Claridge London on the candle as well. There was no evidence. There was no evidence of link. There was nothing. The judge took judicial notice of the fact that people would inevitably link and that consumers would inevitably purchase the candles thinking they were luxury. Why? Transfer of image from Claridge's hotels. Claridge did not have a registration for candles, the hotel. But they're well known. Doesn't matter if it's dissimilar goods. They win. Trademark infringement. 10-3. 10-3 was the first part of the judgment. And this is why I say, don't bother with confusion most of the time. The judge looked at 10-3 first, held yes, unfair advantage. Oh, I better go and look at 10-2 as well. The focus is that it's a lower bar. You don't have to worry about confusion. This is a registry decision that then went up from the registry. You can appeal. It ended up at the High Court. So this is actually a higher authority than Claridge's. It's on registrability, but it's exactly the same provisions. So for the lawyers in the room, it's a 5-3 case rather than a 10-3 case. And Monster were trying to register Red Dog, DAWG. The hearing officer, UK IPO, said they win on unfair advantage and that they lose on confusion. Now, bear in mind, in the registry, far less evidence needed, so it's a bit less important if you throw the kitchen sink at a registry. It's far more important in the High Court because you've got to prove all of that stuff. I'll come on to that. So it gets appealed, gets to the High Court. High Court agrees. Unfair advantage. Why is it an unfair advantage? It's got all of the elements that we've just been talking about. Red Bull has a reputation. Judicial notice. people will make a link. They associate red on energy drinks with Red Bull. People will make a link from the fact that Monster are using Red Dog. They will make that link. Is there a transfer of image? Change in economic behaviour? Judicial notice? Court says yes. Why? It's up there. And I love this part of the analysis because this shows actually how straightforward these claims can be. When they were looking at why they chose it, they said, well, you chose it for a reason. It's a brand. You chose it for it's a brand. You chose it for a reason. It must have an impact on economic behaviour. Otherwise, you wouldn't have chosen it. That is a very low bar for establishing impact on economic behaviour. And as I'll look at shortly, the same happened yesterday. Exactly the same analysis. This is quite easy to show impact on economic behaviour. This one's interesting, just really to pick up on and sort of conclude where Steve's got to in his report. This is a passing off case. Going through the courts at the moment. There's been an interim decision on it, and the case is now being fought, and there'll be a judgment shortly. But it's passing off. It's a passing off case. The reason I've put it in is twofold. I will tell you how I would have run this case, and it wouldn't be as a passing off case. But secondly, this thinking is what Steve was talking about. Judges are in this strange position. There's this sort of artifice in our legal profession that the judge has to put himself in the position of a reasonable consumer. We've got very sophisticated IP judges. They are very good on intellectual property. They are not very good on consumer behavioural science. So these comments are in the judgment of the interim decision. They are so out of date in terms of how consumers actually behave. This is the traditional thinking that Steve was talking about. This is, oh, well, name comes first. Name's more important. Brands are all about names. So when you look at AU Vodka, it's all about AU. The other, the lookalike that's being sued is NE10, which is neon and its atomic number. Totally different to AU. Nothing like it. Well, conceptually it's quite similar. But more importantly, it's the least impactful part of that packaging. That is very, very impactful packaging. And it's not because it has the words AU written on it. So this is, in a way, what we're up against in terms of judicial thinking. And it's why the sort of analysis that we're talking about today and just thinking a bit more creatively about these claims and what evidence to put in is so important, because the judges aren't averse to this stuff. There's a judge called Mr. Justice Newey, Commercial Court, who took on board a whole load of expert psychological evidence on how unreliable witnesses are, witness memory, witness recollection. 10 pages of his judgment is warning all judges, when you hear a witness, they're not trying to lie, but they're reinventing history because they don't remember it and it benefits them. So you should give far less weight to witness evidence than documentary evidence. So the courts are, they're persuadable on this stuff. They just need educating. Brands need to run the right cases to educate them. So that's the AU vodka case. How would I have run that case? This is quite an important step in getting rid of lookalikes. You need to register the right trademark. AU vodka is a passing off case. Entire packaging is registrable as a trademark. There is no doubt about it. We've got loads of them through, including that one for Twix. It satisfies all the criteria to be registrable. It's even named as being one of the things that you can register. Ditto for three-dimensional marks. We'll look at that shortly. That might be the way to go, depending on your packaging. But very much registrable. Why? Because it performs one of the functions of a trademark. Not only does it show you the origin, so it guarantees the origin of the product. Yes, tick, trademark. It is the essential marketing function, is the packaging. So if you I like Malibu as an example because when the original L'Oreal case came out, which was the one that said advertising and marketing function, you can do something if that's being abused. At the time, I was acting for Pernod Ricard, who owned Malibu, and I looked at that and thought, hang on a minute, we can get rid of all of the Malibu lookalikes based on that. Why? Malibu's a really good product to give this as an example, because if you walked into a shop with a yellow bottle that said white Caribbean rum, you wouldn't buy it. Probably wouldn't even know what it was. Okay. People know Malibu from teenage memories of throwing up on it, but also because of what it looks like. It's that white. We don't even know, half the time they don't even know what they're drinking. It's white Caribbean rum. But you establish that through the packaging, the white, the sunset, the sea. It's got nothing to do with the product. It's to do with the packaging. So that's why packaging is absolutely registrable. Nivea is another good example. You know, I was given the example of looking for petroleum jelly in the supermarket. Walk into Boots and find Nivea. It's a beacon. You will find it instantly. It's part of their trademark, is the packaging. So how do you go about it? Just register it all. Traditional thinking is register the distinctive elements. So you end up with these odd marks where bits are chopped out. You think, well, we need the name because that's really important, but there's other bits there that we can't really claim we've got any particular ownership of. Wrong. Register the entire packaging. There may be budgetary concerns there. There are a lot of big brand owners here. You can't register everything. But the other beauty of this is you can register it after the event. So once you are targeted by a lookalike, you can register. There's nothing they can do to stop you. You've got prior use, so your packaging that's been targeted can be registered now. You've got prior use. It's not a bad faith registration. So yesterday's judgment, Lidl were held to have made a bad faith registration because they went for the blank version, just the circle on the square with no word in it. Held to be bad faith because they had no genuine intention of using it. We're not in that territory. These are the marks that are actually being used. It's not a bad faith registration. How do you go about proving it? Well, I'm a litigator. I would love to say with confidence, you don't need to prove much here because the law's all going in your favour. Link's dead easy. Reputation's dead easy. Link, they've deliberately targeted you. Their own disclosure will show they've deliberately targeted you, so you don't need to worry about evidence on that. Change in economic behaviour, obvious. If you need some help, Steve's up there. But joking aside, the research is all there in terms of the consumer behavioural science. So showing the change in economic behaviour is very easy. Now, I'm not brave enough to say that you should put no evidence in on these things. You obviously need to think about the evidence. It's quite easy to get. So on Link, it's a social media troll. It's what I was talking about. People chat about the lookalikes all the time. They're making that link. They're not confused. They're making a link. It's all you need. That also, by the way, is your transfer of image evidence as well. Change in economic behaviour is the one that I'm a bit more nervous about, and that's why we're sort of looking at all of these areas today, because it is there. You can show the change in economic behaviour. There's consumer behavioural science, research that shows it. But actually, the reported cases so far, the court hasn't needed it. It's just said, as a consequence of targeting these brands with your lookalikes, you're doing it for a reason. And you're doing it to change your own customers' economic behaviour. You want them to buy your stuff. That's good enough. So it's a really, really low bar. So that's the checklist of what you need to get rid of a lookalike. Have the right registration. If you haven't, and you can't persuade your firm, your company to give you enough budget to do it, wait until after the event. Nothing they can do to stop you registering your packaging after the event and going after them. You delay yourself for 3 months. You can't go back historically on damages, but these are rarely about damages, these claims. These are about stopping the lookalike. You got Link. The link's deliberate. You don't even need that, but the link's deliberate. Change in economic behaviour, yep, easy. Commercial boost, yes. So these claims, at the moment, I genuinely cannot see a way out of these claims if you're trying to defend on. If you've got all of those in place and the right registration, the way all of these authorities have gone, there doesn't seem to be a defence to them. We were totting up for this seminar. We think we got rid of about 70 lookalikes on this. It should be simple, okay? You don't need to run confusion claims, and that's where, if you run a 10-2 confusion claim, you're running a passing off claim, you have to prove it. And that's where you end up with very expensive legal fees are trying to find out if there is confusion. And if there is confusion, is it genuine confusion? So there is a much, much simpler way of doing it. And we have a low-cost IP court in IPEC. And it's no coincidence the number of these cases are in IPEC. The reason I say I can't be as brave as to say don't ever have any evidence. Now, you can all call me a massive hypocrite, but this is a case that I've just defended on that logo. And I don't know if anybody recognises or makes a link with any other sportswear brand from that logo. I don't want to know the answer because I'm filming it and they might appeal it. But they argued, believe it or not, they argued it was Umbro. Now, they failed. Why did they fail? Very good defence put together. But the real reason they failed is link. They had nothing. They had no evidence. This was sold on Amazon, and that makes a big difference. All of these products come from China, and they're sold on Amazon. They're sold on Amazon as Dream Pairs. That's the brand, Dream Pairs. No mention of Umbro anywhere at all, including Amazon reviews, including online. Nobody had made any link that they could evidence between that logo and Umbro. It was not a transfer of image case the court held, and there was no unfair advantage. So much as I would like to say, you really don't need that much evidence. It's obviously dependent on the case. And the fact that these shoes were all sold on Amazon, we thought was going to be a big factor. It turned out to be. They're not sold side by side, so you haven't got this attraction towards the brand. You haven't got them you're not seeing them sitting side by side to get the transfer of image. It's far more of a lottery if it's just sold online. I think somebody got a question about that later. We'll probably talk about that in the discussion group. It doesn't have to cost the earth. The way these cases are going, that list I just gave you, it all just follows. One follows the other. If you stick it to unfair advantage claims, there doesn't seem to be a route for defending it. And indeed, they don't defend it. I'll come on to that. So there's a couple of interesting ones coming up. This one is still going. And I like this one because I think it demonstrates quite how wide these unfair advantage claims can and should be. The registration is on the left, so they haven't gone for a full packaging registration. They've basically gone for the key part of the artwork. Do people know that? People know Thatcher's cider? Presumably, yeah. So it's a very simple design. It's very simple, but it's become very well known. So they've got the reputation. There's the Aldi lookalike. Aldi, in its pleading, in its defence, has admitted that they took and deliberately took lemons, yellow, green, white background, black centralised typeface. Their answer is, or their defence is, everything else is decorative. The only bit that's trademarky is Taurus. That's different enough to Thatcher's. I say they're wrong on that. It's overall impression. You look at one against the other. That's the registration. Do you make a link with that? Of course you make a link with that. Are they similar? Yep. It's got a reputation. Is it a transfer of image case? Yes. That's why they've done it. Is there a change in economic behaviour? Yes. That's why they've done it. And if you need help, put in some consumer behavioural science to show that this is how lookalikes work, so the judges understand how they work. Then finally, and we might end up talking about this on the panel, the reason I thanked Lidl is because the Lidl tried to rely upon the registration without the word Lidl in it, the wordless mark it was called. The court held that was a bad faith registration because they never had any intention to use it. It was there purely for litigation, so they could try and warn people off that colour combination. So the court assessed it on the basis of the Lidl mark. Held similar. Yep, fair enough. I mean, arguable, but held similar. Held to be link. There was loads of evidence of link, absolutely loads of social media evidence that people were making the link. Once you've got the link, you're looking at whether or not it's transfer of image. Yes, the court said yes. The court said that Lidl had a reputation not only in discount supermarkets, but in yellow and blue signifying discount. Bingo. That's why they've scored an own goal, okay? Because everything we're talking about today, particularly with Steve's report, is that colour comes first, okay? Lidl, in their own case, are arguing, forget Lidl, you don't need to worry about the word. Yellow and blue is what this case is about, and we own that, and it signifies discount supermarkets. Bingo. Colour. I agree. The part of the case that I think is going to be challenged, and I think there'll be a lot of commentary on the right-hand side, is the copyright case that succeeded. Now, copyright's not, well, we can take questions on copyright. Copyright is normally a much more difficult claim because it's very touchy-feely, it's nebulous, there isn't that much law on it, and it all comes down to the judge's view on substantial reproduction, okay? Traditional thinking, a case called Designers Guild, says that the law of copyright better protects hedgehogs than foxes. Nice judicial thinking. What does it mean? What it means is if you've got a very simple design circle with some spikes on it, to infringe the copyright in that, not all circles with spikes on it will infringe the copyright. You've got to be almost identical for a similar design to infringe copyright. If you've got a sophisticated animated fox with quite a creative element in it, you don't have to reproduce as much of it to infringe the copyright. Okay, so simple designs traditionally are a lot harder for copyright, and in this case, the court has held that if you look at the Lidl, there are 3 elements of it in the word. Okay, the word is not reproduced, totally different font, totally different artwork, £9 club card price, none of that's reproduced. The yellow ring is not reproduced. Sorry, the red ring. What is reproduced is yellow circle on blue. Now, if you're looking at substantiality, and unfortunately the judgment gives very little on how the judge has come to the conclusion it was substantial, but she's held that it was copyright infringement. Now, I think there'll be a lot of debate about that case, but ironically, it potentially opens the door for copyright cases as well against the lookalike packaging. So going back to the Thatcher's example, it's all there. All of the original creative stuff is in there. The fact it's not that original, on the back of this judgment, Thatcher's could potentially even run a copyright case, which I find a surprising outcome. I don't find the unfair advantage analysis surprising in that case. So, there we are. Unfair advantage claims are the way forward. We're going to have a short break now. We're running about 7 minutes over, so we'll have a 5-minute break, something like that. If people want to go and refresh themselves, there's, I don't know. Oh, here we go. Ice creams are coming. We'll regroup in 5 minutes if we could, just to try and keep it on time, and then
Just a very quick introduction so you know the British Brands Group. We're a not-for-profit collaboration of branded manufacturers. Please don't be misled by our name. We are not a group about British brands. We are the Brands Group in Britain. And there are similar groups around Europe, which we all work with very closely. And we're part of AIM, which is the European Brands Association. And they've been doing some work in lookalikes and some research in lookalikes. So it all, from a brand owner's point of view, there's a lot of coordinated lobbying activity by country on behalf of brands, all championing brands, making sure that the environment in each of our member states and in the UK is conducive to innovation and reputation, etc., etc. So lookalikes was the dynamic that created the group in the first place. Geoff's already told us back in 1994, so we've been working on this a long time, extremely frustratingly, I have to say. So there's a bit of an excitement actually, having had the Lidl and Tesco case, but we'll talk a lot about that. We've done a lot of research on lookalikes over the years. It's all freely available to anybody who wants it. My details, I'll be sticking around. A lot of it's online on our website anyway. And we've looked at most of the policy angles. We looked at the competition angle, we looked at the IP angle, looked at this from a consumer dimension, brand manufacturer dimension, comparative advertising dimension. So yeah, there's a lot on it. So that's the British Brands Group. So I would like, if I may, just to start by saying, if you have a question, I do appreciate there's some sensitivities in this. Ideally, could you just give your name and organisation? But if you don't want to do that and be anonymous, then that's obviously absolutely fine as well. Can I just have a quick reality check to see how many of you have got burning questions at the moment? Because I've got lots here. I've got plenty to keep me going for an hour here. So, but I want this to be led by you. So who has questions generally speaking, or shall we start with some of the ones that have been sent to us earlier on? So there are a couple. Very good, excellent. So please hold those. Because there were some that were submitted right at the beginning before the event even started. And I really like, actually, this is the first one in, and I think it really sums up the frustration of brand owners. So the question is greater investment in ever-expanding suite of IP filings for brand owners the only answer? It feels like brand owners bear all the cost in every sense, and the rhino-hided copycats continue on unsanctioned and unscathed. Is it all this as bleak as it feels? So I think that's probably a question for you, Geoff, initially.
Yeah. I was actually discussing it over the break there when I was asked the same question. So obviously it depends on budget. It depends upon how important the brand is, whether it's a hero brand, etc. But one of the things that we've been doing for the clients, and you can't necessarily anticipate what the lookalike is going to target, okay? So if you take a typical FMCG, there might be different pack varieties, there might be different flavors. You could end up with a whole suite of different options in terms of registrations. Now, the answer, if you are looking only to combat the lookalike rather than just some wider brand protection in protecting everything, it's what I was talking about at the end of my session. There's nothing to stop you waiting for the lookalike and then register the best mark, and we've done that for a number of clients. So that is a far cheaper way of doing it, and you're doing it for a purpose. And just to touch again on that bad faith point, you do see a lot of registrations that are going in that keep a number of elements of the packaging off the packaging. It's what's happened in the Lidl case. Is it just future proofing? Is it evergreening? Is it bad faith? That doesn't apply here. So it's not bad faith to enforce a brand you are already using in which you already have a reputation. So yes, the onus is on you. It's frustrating as the brand owners. Yes, you are going to have to do something to take action against the lookalike, but there is a far more streamlined way of doing it. Wait until they've mimicked, register the best one, the closest one to that, and then go IPEC. Keep it cheap. One thing, because we were running out of time a bit at the back there, don't think of this in terms of, well, there's a huge litigation budget that I need as well. Because these cases, bearing in mind the business model of Aldi and Lidl, they really can't afford for there to be a test case and a judgment. These cases get unlocked when you take action. And this whole debate about commercial realities, and we still want them as a customer. So if Aldi turn around and say, well, you're our business partner, business partners don't sue us. The answer is, you're our business partner. Business partners don't infringe our rights. And in terms of targeting it, it's easy to target. You're not going to have to go very deep, and it will be an IPEC if you do. So yes, it's frustrating. There's a cost involved, but there is a much, much more streamlined way. And don't run confusion. Do not run confusion. Run unfair advantage. Really streamlined way of doing it. But yes, a cost ultimately.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to move to a behavioural question now, which is really interesting. You sort of touched on in your last example on the trainers. So what is the difference in behaviour? And this, I guess, is one for you. What is the difference in behaviour between in-store and online? Do lookalikes really only work in-store? So I guess we're talking about packaging, generally, but your trainer one was a product design as opposed to a packaging design.
Yeah. So I'll mention that first, because I think, yes, absolutely, the location of the sale is highly relevant to all of those tests we were talking about on unfair advantage. So are you going to get link evidence if they're not side by side? More difficult. If it's sold only on Amazon and it's sold very clearly as not being the brand that is bringing the claim, it's more difficult. But if you were to sell, and they don't, and ironically, we do a lot of this stuff, and when we're trying to find exactly what Aldi and Lidl are doing, it's often quite difficult to find the lookalikes they're doing. They're quite, for a social media team that is celebrating Aldi, they're quite coy about actually showing what their products are a lot of the time. But if the infringement in Aldi is sold online, it still ticks all of those boxes on link because they're so close. Whereas if you're looking at something like the Umbro Dream Pairs, that's a lot harder because it's just not really close enough. Nobody was making the link. But place of sale is relevant, yes.
I think I'd also like to add to that and say actually there's a massive dupe culture online where people are actively looking for lookalikes because they don't want to pay a higher premium for the original product. One of them that comes to mind is Lululemon activewear, women's clothing. If you go on Amazon and type Lululemon does not sell their products on Amazon, but loads of Chinese brands using the same material, completely copying the color, shape, packaging, everything. They're doing really well. Go on YouTube and type customer reviews of these kind of things, and people are actively comparing, hi guys, this is my Lululemon short, and then these are my online Chinese version, but I actually prefer these ones. And so there's that element of generational differences. There's an element of people who are constantly shopping online and never really in person, being the consumers who will be consuming these lookalikes and actively boosting the sales, making it cool as well.
I mean, I'll just close the mic for me on that question. Ultimately, it's still a question of evidence. So it's just, if it's sold online and only online, the evidence might be harder to get, but you still tick all of the boxes. If it's a lookalike and too close, all of those, reputation, link, transfer of image, change of economic behaviour, they're all still there, but you might have to fight a bit harder to find evidence, for example, of link.
The next question, which is this afternoon, is all about actually, but it's comes from from brand owners who have products with generic names. So I guess we're talking rich tea, digestive, cornflakes, for example. So how can they best defend themselves against the lookalikes? So I suspect that means register the whole pack. Did you have anything to add to that? Or?
Yeah, well, again, it goes to the outcome of Steve's report about name actually being one of the least important things. What colour is rich tea packaging? Everybody knows. Now, why does that type of biscuit have to be blue? It doesn't. It's that colour because it's got the allure, it's got the reputation, it's got the attraction. You know what it is, you know what it tastes like. The rich tea element is far less relevant. The name of it is far less relevant. If it's closer, the problem with products like rich tea is they've sort of become quite generic. So if you were going back in time and starting this all over again, you'd be registering the packaging. But the problem now is, has it got so widespread that it's essentially just a pure product queue rather than a trademark? So it depends upon how distinctive it is, but the analysis still works, and the name is actually, again, far less important on these packaging registrations.
We have you for about 4 minutes left, so quick question to you. So Aldi told us last week that their shoppers aren't stupid. So how possible is it for their shoppers to switch from the system 1 automatic, instinctive, subconscious to a system 2 rationalization saying, oh, I mustn't be misled or duped or influenced by this pack? How easy is it to make that switch between the two systems of thinking?
Well, it's hard actually, for a couple of reasons. The first is that if you think about that quick, fast, automatic type of thinking, it's always on. This is not something you can turn off. Even if you go to sleep, it's still there. It's monitoring the environment and the situation. In order to kind of activate that more considered thinking, you have to turn it on. It's not a reflex. You have to consciously make that decision. I'm going to think about this. I'm going to think about it carefully. I'm going to think about it deeply. So that's one challenge. The second challenge is that unlike that system 1 quick reflexive thinking, which operates multiple systems in parallel, ponderous considered thinking is sequential. You can only think about one thing consciously at a time. That may disappoint some of you in the room that think you're multitaskers, but you're not multitasking. You're simply switching your attention from one thing to another. That's challenging, it's hard, it's effortful, and it's not conducive to a quick, fast, efficient supermarket environment. And in fact, actually, here's clear evidence that the discount supermarkets know this. I've seen lookalike products that have multiple barcodes on them. Why do they have multiple barcodes? Because you go through the checkout quicker. You don't have to worry about, where's the barcode? They are doing everything they possibly can to create an environment of speed, of instantaneous thinking, of quick, automatic, non-consideration of a purchase or a decision. It's not in their interests to get consumers to slow down, and it's not in a consumer's interests to slow down because they're busy. We're all busy. We've got other stuff to do. We don't wake up in the morning and put one of our goals down on paper as to spend half our day in a supermarket. It's a chore. It's something we just want to get over with. So it's possible, John, but it's incredibly hard and difficult. And all of our apparatus of thinking and consideration goes against that instinct.
And Steve, can I just ask a question on that, Steve? When you are in a supermarket situation, you are obviously overwhelmed. Is it the case that it's even more difficult because of the nature of where you are?
Indeed. In the same way as, all of us in the room will probably find it easier to do considered, thoughtful work in a quiet environment where there aren't phones ringing, where there aren't, one of the things that's really interesting about this concept of trying to get people back to work is sometimes working from home is haven-like. We can get a lot more, I know that I get a lot more work done productively if I'm sitting in my home office and I'm not having people coming past the desk every 5 minutes, these kind of distractions. So a distracted environment, a overly stimulated environment is ripe for those aspects. I think, Ibs, you wanted to.
Yeah, actually that feeds back into your question on online, because maybe it's possible that when people are shopping online, they have a lot more time, a lot more cognitive capacity to make these decisions, do comparisons, open another tab, leave that open for 2 days, think about it, mull it over. So just thought about that. Also, another thing is it's really hard to get people to admit they've made a mistake. We mentioned this in our report on post-choice rationalization. Once they have made a mistake, not many people will raise their hand and be like, oh, yes, I've been duped. A lot of times people will actually justify that and say, yeah, I know I picked up the lookalike. I actually like it a lot more than the other one. So that's another factor to consider. Yeah.
That really resonates with me because Which did a big consumer research. This is going back a few years now. And sadly, it asked the question, it demonstrated a lot of consumers were confused, but it asked the question, are consumers bothered? And a lot of consumers said, no, we're not bothered, because they're not going to admit that they made a mistake. And they seized on that and said, well, this is not an issue for us because consumers aren't bothered. Yeah. I'm going to pick up some of the questions and I'm going to work from your right to left. So there was a question over there. Can you like to, no microphone, I'm afraid, so would you like just to shout it out?
It will be appealed. They've said it's going to be appealed. Having read the whole judgment yesterday, I agree with you. The copyright claim looks vulnerable. I'm very surprised by the outcome of that copyright case. It will be appealed. They will inevitably appeal everything. The difficulty on appeal, and I don't think the unfair advantage decision will be undermined, is because it is a 102-page judgment, and the judge has been very cautious at explaining all of the evidence for the link and confusion. They won on confusion as well. They won on passing off, and they won on section 10.2, likelihood of confusion, and link and unfair advantage. So there is a lot of evidence, almost overwhelming evidence, that was gathered there. It was very clever. I mean, one of the things that a lot of time was spent and a lot of cost was spent on was a survey, not to try and find confusion, but to try and find what people associate with the colours yellow and blue. And the answer was discount. Now, that was an enormous exercise that was undertaken, but they actually established that those colours signify discount. Okay, so the evidence on unfair advantage and on likelihood of confusion could only really lead to one outcome. There's no errors of law on any of that. It's, I put it up on the screen. This is all quite established stuff now. The Glee test, the judge just went through line by line the Glee test and applied it. And it's difficult to see how that will be undermined. It will be appealed, and there'll be a round two. Everything will be appealed. But yes, I agree with you. I think the copyright judgment is the vulnerable part of that.
Let's stick with let's go little for a moment, and let's have a System 1 exercise amongst you all. System 1 means I want instinctive reactions from you all, please. So is this case a game changer that might lead to potential change of behaviour from the discount retailers? Or is it just a one-off case that just revolved around its in particular merits? So can I have a show of hands, who thinks that the test, notwithstanding any appeal, is this Tesco Lidl a game changer? Show of hands. 1, 2. Ooh. So
That just means a lot of people haven't read the judgment yet, John.
right.
It only came out yesterday.
I'm going to follow through on this though. So who thinks it is just a one-off case? And then it may be then anybody who doesn't put a hand up at all just thinks, yeah. So there's still, but it's a one-off case seems to be the majority. But anyway, yeah. Interesting.
Again, just to finish that, on the sequence of authorities, it's a really nice one, because the Claridge's case is IPEC, about 10-page judgment. The Red Bull Red Dog case started off in the registry, so not much evidence, got to the High Court, but again, about a 10-page judgment. Argos is a really useful one, that's High Court, that's about 20-page judgment. Even the Umbro one that I put up, there's a fair bit of commentary on 10.3. This is a 100-page judgment, High Court, endorsing, as I've said, not only all of the existing tests that shows that if you apply that to packaging, you win essentially, but it also is confirming this point that yellow and the yellow and blue is part of the brand, the most important part of the brand. The colour is the most important part of the brand. So game changer, no, but very, very useful decision that I will certainly be using against them. So yeah, there's nothing new in it, but it's a really, really helpful development of the law.
Great, thank you. Moving on to Bryn, if we may. So you've given us brand owners a great model to how to assess financially the impact of a lookalike. But there must be a difference. Say you're a health and beauty brand, there must be a difference on impact. If you are selling through Boots, for example, Boots, your largest customer, has copied you, as opposed to an Aldi or a Lidl copy. How would that impact the model? And how do you assess by retailer?
Yeah. Well, first of all, yeah, I completely agree with you. I think so the level of impact at Boots certainly would be higher in the case of a cosmetic or beauty product. But I think ultimately to sort of model the impact on brand value is through research and through customer and brand research and insights. And like I tried to demonstrate the impact that has on brand value. So I think what a brand owner needs to do as part of their existing sort of brand performance tracking and measurement, it's a case of getting down to that level of granularity. And I think I've been able to prove that sort of lookalikes is more than a mild irritation. I think now is an opportunity perhaps through the sort of the brand research to be able to understand and certainly track the impact of lookalikes. And it may be, changes to the fundamental research that looks at performance of the lookalike brand, certainly of your brand across the various channels and categories, and understanding from the customers, for instance, do they shop at these retail stores, and just try and understand if their responses differ across the different channels, and then trying to elicit the impact of the lookalike and the impact on your brand through customer responses across the different channels. And then ultimately that sort of feeds into the brand valuation exercise.
Very helpful, thank you very much. Now there was a question in the back in the middle. Is that still a live question? Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first point is that the fundamental framework and the integrity of that framework is essentially consistent. So I talked about the three areas, almost sort of like the input measures, the sort of the consumer or sort of perceptions in the market, and then the more sort of hard-nosed financial brand performance measures. I think we always retain the integrity of those three. But I think the point is, brand to brand, almost sector to sector as well, some of the underlying metrics within it can vary and can differ. Some of the important brand measures within sort of retail will be very different to the brand performance measures in some of the sort of more B2B or industrial sectors. So I think it's a case of it's often a collaborative exercise with the client. in terms of what data that they have, what are the metrics they're currently tracking, and then being able to retain the integrity, but being able to sort of design it and populate it in a way that you can, and you actually have that information, and it's specific to that brand and that sector. And certainly, if the brand is a lot smaller, then we'll take that into consideration as well. What we're trying to do essentially is trying to figure out as many sort of relevant metrics and a balanced scorecard, and just trying to do the best job possible to really understand the value of the brand and how that's impacting brand value. In terms of the weightings, yeah, again, it's collaborative exercise, and it may be sector specific. There may be some various metrics or areas for a particular sector that's really, really important in driving brand strength. There may be a particular stakeholder audience that's particularly important in generating brand value. So you have those considerations and you work through the client. When it comes to the middle component, which is around sort of the consumer perceptions, often what we'll find from our clients is they'll have some good sort of brand equity data. They've already done perhaps some weighting analysis to see which of these metrics are actually the most important in driving brand preference or brand consideration. So a lot of that drivers analysis may have been done, and we can feed it in.
Great, thank you very much. Were there any other questions? Yes. Yeah, the grocery code practice, you're talking GSCOP, I mean, because that's a big area of focus for us, not at all useful in this area at all. I think essentially you can dismiss it. I mean, we tried to get it included. The competition authority said no. If you wanted to change the code, essentially you need a new market investigation by the Competition and Markets Authority, not an attractive option. So I think really the code is one where I don't think you should, it's worthwhile spending any length of time on. And certainly the adjudicator wouldn't give it the time of day, sadly. Yeah.
Can I just add one thing on the code? One thing that is very nice in the code, and we get this a lot, is the clients coming back and saying, well, we don't really want to take on Aldi Lidl because it'll delist us. Okay. There's a section in the code on delisting. It doesn't deal with enforcement of IP rights, but it does say you can't delist as a result of a breach of contractual arrangements, a breach of rights. Now, extrapolating that, I don't really see how an adjudicator could say it's fine to delist when all the delisted client is doing is enforcing its IP. So these, to be fair to the supermarkets, they don't make the threats. It's always clients worrying about, will it have an impact? Will we be delisted? And I think that's why they never play that card. I've never had a claim that we've run against one of the supermarkets and they've come back and tried to delist, because I think they know that enforcement of the IP is not a legitimate commercial reason to delist. So there is a nice little nugget buried in there in the armoury if you need it. But as I say, they don't really play that card. I think they know why.
Question, second row from the back. Well, Geoff and I obviously have a different view on this. I mean, my view is you're not. I mean, what the code says is that retailers can't delist you, must delist you for genuine commercial reasons. That's essentially the element of it. And that's a really, really low bar for a retailer to meet. So they can come up with all sorts of reasons why they want to delist you, which have nothing to do with any litigation or anything else. That's where the code doesn't help you. I think that provision in the code is really saying you can't be delisted for invoking the code, but the code is silent on IP rights.
Yeah.
So that's the challenge.
Can I just check if I've understood your question? Were you saying what happens if you supply the supermarket with the lookalike? Yeah. Yeah, but so you fill the packaging, essentially, right? So that is an interesting situation that I have had to look at before, because the problem with that is you can enforce your IP rights as long as you haven't waived your IP rights or somehow acquiesced in the infringement. Now, in the situation where it's your factory, it's getting packaged, your products are going into it, that makes it a lot more difficult because you've seen the packaging, you've endorsed the packaging. So It doesn't impact on any of the infringement tests. It potentially gives a defence of waiver or of acquiescence. So it complicates it. I'll take that one. Again, that's a question of evidence. So yes, in theory, particularly if it's been left to go for a long time and everybody does blue for those biscuits, you can't then try and rely upon that element of it as being what's taken unfair advantage of because it's become. However, if there is link evidence still being made and you have got the right registration, and it's just a question of your evidence has probably been diluted as a result of it, where it really damages you is if you're trying to run a confusion case, because it's very difficult to say there's a misrepresentation because everybody's doing it. It's very difficult to say that there will be confusion because everybody's doing it. So that's probably a good example of where you need to modernize and update your packaging without using any of the brand elements, but get them to then target that packaging, mimic it so it's too close to what you're now doing. The unfair advantage stuff still all works there because you're just looking for link. So there is a way through it, but it complicates it.
And I'm afraid on that note, we're out of time. And I'm really sorry not to be able to get to your question, but hopefully you can stay for a drink and ask it privately. That's all right. So I think that draws this session to a close.
Yeah,
Thank you, Geoff.
We're out of time if people are happy to be out of time. I don't know if people have got to rush off, but if there are one or two, we could do a couple more questions if people want to. Yeah, so the point I was making earlier on cost is these claims don't have to cost you. Then the likes of Aldi and Lidl are not going to let these cases get to trial because they don't want a test case. So actually, it does often get unlocked by threatening a claim or even issuing a claim and not taking it very deep. But no, you don't have to get to trial. You don't have to get to judgment. A lot of the case, you'll end up in a negotiation about what their packaging should look like going forwards. Yeah, no, I agree with that. And these cases are never about, once you establish an infringement, you can go after them for an account of profits. But they're very rarely about that. You very rarely get that far. It's about changing the packaging. Is it worthwhile for the lookalike? It absolutely is. Going back to what I was saying about the Aldi model, to the extent that we get to a position, because everybody's going after them for lookalikes, they have to have a real rethink on their whole model. Because that is the basis, particularly for Aldi. That's what they're doing. They're discounting in the UK by mimicking UK products. Until we get to a position where they actually are having to fight too many fires, it'll absolutely be worthwhile for them.
And just to think, in terms of lookalikes, good for revenue, good for sales. If people want evidence on, actually, there's also the opportunity to charge more. There's a good Scottish case, which is Little Hampstead Gin against Hendrick's Gin, where it was in a distinctive pack, moved to a larger lookalike pack, and the price, rather than decreasing, consumer price rather than decreasing, increased by 15%. So that was, and so the only thing that changed essentially was the pack design. So there was a
can I just expand that point? Because the other thing on the pricing is this is sleight of hand by the supermarkets, because by making this link and the transfer of image and everything else, they charge more than they would otherwise be able to charge for an unbranded equivalent product. So it's a massive sleight of hand, because what they're doing is they're getting the credit from the consumers of thinking this is great, I get the brand and it's a lot cheaper. No, they're actually paying a lot more. Well, they're paying more for it than they should be, purely by virtue of the fact that it has mimicked. If it was in my yellow packaging that I was talking about for Fine Fair, they wouldn't be charging as much.
I'm really sorry. I'm now getting the eye from the top there. So that really is the last question. I'm so sorry. If we can pick it up afterwards. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. And we're hanging around for drinks. Everybody on the panel, if you would like to talk about this, I will talk about this for days on end. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to our panel. And thank you, John.